By September 1997, Apple was 2 months from bankruptcy. This is a fact that gets repeated often enough that it has lost its weight. Apple, the company that would eventually become the most valuable in the world, was not merely in financial difficulty in 1997. It was 60 days from being unable to pay its bills. The condition was not a temporary cash flow challenge. It was the end of a sustained institutional collapse. By 1997, the company had laid off 3,800 employees, lost over $1 billion in a year, and was struggling to stay afloat. Steve Jobs returned as interim CEO. The condition Apple was in was not simply financial distress, it was strategic incoherence. The company had accumulated over 350 products. There were multiple versions of the Macintosh competing with each other. There were printers, scanners, Newton PDAs, a line of cameras. There were licensing agreements that allowed clone manufacturers to produce Mac-compatible computers, generating some revenue and systematically destroying Apple's margins and brand distinctiveness. Apple had been through a series of CEOs and strategic pivots that had left the organization without a clear sense of what it was actually for. Every financial model available in September 1997 pointed in one direction. Every analyst who covered Apple had, at this point, largely stopped covering it seriously. The company had become too far gone to warrant the analytical effort. The most optimistic scenario most industry observers entertained was an acquisition that would let Apple's remaining assets be absorbed by someone else. Nobody was modeling a comeback. Nobody was projecting that this company, 2 months from bankruptcy, with 350 products and no coherent strategy, would become the most valuable company in human history within 15 years. The comeback nobody modeled for is the episode's subject, not because it teaches a lesson about perseverance or vision. Those lessons exist and are available elsewhere. Because it teaches something specific about why certain organizational failures are not what they appear to be, and about the specific decisions that convert a crisis into a foundation rather than into an ending. Upon his return, Jobs' first task was to simplify Apple's bloated product lines. "We were selling a lot of crap," Jobs remarked. His strategy was ruthless but necessary. He cut 70% of Apple's inventory, scrapped the Newton message pad, and ended the Macintosh clone program. Jobs cut projects from 70 to just 4, allowing the company to build only what mattered. The simplification was not primarily a cost-cutting exercise, though it saved money. It was a diagnostic exercise. Of everything Apple was doing, what was it actually capable of doing well? The 350 products were not 350 failures. Some of them were fine products. They were 350 products competing for the same organizational attention, engineering talent, and manufacturing capacity, none of which was sufficient to do 350 things well simultaneously. The reduction to 4 products did not eliminate capability. It concentrated it. The engineering resources that had been distributed across 350 products, diluted to the point where none of them was receiving enough attention to be excellent, were redirected to 4 products that would receive the full organizational attention available. The $150 million bailout from Microsoft was announced at the 1997 Macworld Expo. Jobs explained that to get Apple healthy and prospering again, there were some things that needed to be let go of. Jobs receiving cheers and boos for the Microsoft deal at the Macworld audience is one of the most documented moments in the Apple recovery story. The boos were rational. Apple's identity had been built in explicit opposition to Microsoft. Accepting money from Microsoft felt like a capitulation. The cheers were also rational. 60 days from bankruptcy, capitulation that keeps the company alive is worth more than principled independence that ends it. Have you ever watched an organization make a decision that felt like a betrayal of its identity, but that turned out to be the specific thing that preserved what made the identity worth having? leave a comment. The turnaround was made possible by a simplification that most companies in crisis resist, because simplification requires accepting losses that feel unaffordable precisely when the business can least afford them. This is the specific organizational mechanism that made the Apple comeback possible and that makes most organizational comebacks impossible. When a company is in crisis, every product line has advocates who believe it could be the one that turns things around. Every capability has a team that believes their work is the exception, the thing that should be preserved even as cuts are made elsewhere. The organizational pressure in a crisis is toward preserving more, not toward cutting more, because the fear of eliminating the thing that might have saved you is greater than the fear of retaining the things that are contributing to the crisis. Jobs' willingness to cut 70% of Apple's products, to accept the losses that simplification required, was possible because of his specific combination of authority and certainty. He had the authority as CEO to override the organizational resistance. He had the certainty derived from a clear conviction about what Apple's core capability actually was, to know which 4 products to keep without extensive deliberation. Jobs wasn't just a product genius. He was a master storyteller, marketer, and brand visionary. The iMac, launched in 1998, was the physical expression of the strategy that the simplification had made possible. With colorful, translucent sides, the inner workings of the computer were visible, a design statement that announced Apple had returned to what it had always been best at, products that made computing feel different from anything else. The iMac sold 800,000 units in its first 139 days. Apple returned to profitability. If the specific organizational mechanism, how the willingness to accept losses in simplification is the prerequisite for the focus that recovery requires, is what makes this channel worth your time. The like is the direct signal. The 3,800 Apple employees who had been laid off before Jobs' return were not there to see the recovery. The people who remained were working inside an organization whose daily experience of the crisis was specific and unrelenting. Cancelled projects, departing colleagues, products being killed, the public narrative of a company that was finished. The specific thing that Jobs changed in the first weeks of his return was not the products, it was the direction. The organization that had been in an extended state of strategic incoherence, making decisions without a clear organizing principle, suddenly had a very clear organizing principle. Build 4 products, build them better than anyone. Build them for people who care about design and experience. Everything else stops. The clarity was not comfortable. The cuts were real. The friends who left were not coming back. But the clarity was what made the remaining work feel purposeful again. And purposeful work, in a company where the people who remained had come to Apple because they cared about what it was building, was the organizational fuel that the recovery required. Under Jobs, Apple's market cap grew from under $5 billion in 1997 to over $300 billion by 2011. The practical lesson from the Apple 1997 case is not about what to do when a company is in crisis. It is more specific than that. The lesson is about the relationship between incoherence and crisis. Apple in 1997 was not primarily in a financial crisis. It was in a strategic incoherence crisis that had produced a financial crisis as a consequence. The 350 products were not a financial problem that could be solved by better accounting. They were a strategic problem, a failure to answer the question, what is this company for? That had produced financial consequences because an organization that cannot answer that question cannot allocate resources in a way that produces excellence. The companies that navigate this moment well tend to be the ones that can hold 2 things simultaneously: a clear conviction about what the core actually is, and the discipline to let everything else go. The clear conviction is available to many leaders in a crisis. The discipline to let everything else go, to accept the specific losses, the specific departures, the specific grief of eliminating things that were once believed in, is the part that most leaders in crisis cannot maintain. The organizational pressure against letting things go is always greater than the organizational pressure against maintaining incoherence, because the losses are immediate and visible, and the benefits of coherence are future and uncertain. Jobs was able to maintain that discipline in 1997 because he had a conviction about what Apple was that was independent of what Apple had become. The conviction was not a plan. It was a belief about the kind of organization Apple was capable of being, and a willingness to cut everything that was inconsistent with that belief until the remaining organization could actually be it. The next episode looks at the variable that every plan assumes is fixed, and what happens when that assumption fails. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.